Lover's Moon, a novel by Mark Leslie and Julie Strauss. Read by the authors. Wednesday, September 28th, 2011. Chapter 15. Michael, 5:15 p.m.
I only want Remedu,
Gail said.
That's my favorite.
This was our first time shopping together, not to mention my first experience picking up groceries with anyone else. And I was surprised at how unique and domesticated the experience felt. Gail was in it to win it, approaching this mundane task with the zest and intentness of a wedding planner. It was as if she was competing for a segment on Master Chef instead of planning for a picnic in Central Park. The whole time we'd been in this high-end grocery store, she jumped into project manager mode. She was rather cute when she got this serious and determined. "As you wish," I said, but she didn't pick up on my nod to the Princess Bride. She was deep in the cheese zone as part of this planning for our picnic.
And maybe grab some Danish blue. Did you like the Brunost? It was the Scandinavian cheese I brought to the 4th of July picnic. That caramelized one that goes on a pizzelle with a little bit of jam.
A pizzelle?
Those little sweet Italian waffle cookies.
Ah, yes, those were delicious. Of course, I didn't get to try them at the 4th of July picnic itself. The whole thing was called off early. I tried most of the amazing foods Gail had prepared later on that night at my place. The evening turned out okay in the end, but it was pretty tense for a while. And it didn't help that Gail had accused me of sleeping with someone else. And I suppose that would have been the perfect opportunity to tell her the truth about my absence. But something about her brother's hostility toward me gave me pause. I'd sensed his fear and hatred for me from several meters away, even as I approached the two of them that day. And I kept getting mixed messages from Ben. Part of him liked me and appreciated the gesture of the champagne I'd brought, the discussion about his work. Those emotions were there, but he kept them closely locked down and didn't let them show. Ben kept returning to the anger, the bitter fear he had about me. The odor of it in the air between us was so thick I could practically taste it. It was as if Ben were sensing something about me, like he knew I'd already lied to her, that it was inevitable I would hurt Gail. So that night, after we'd made up and snuggled together, the last thing I wanted to do was bring up my wolfish nature. I suppose I just wanted to hold her in my arms and pretend that everything would be all right. I was about as good at confrontation as a feather would be at cutting steel. So I let it go and figured I'd bring it up another day. That day didn't come, naturally.
And maybe some añejo, too.
Pardon? She'd been speaking to me, and I'd been in wandering mind mode.
Añejo. It's a Mexican cheese. It'll be really good crumbled over our salad. And maybe also see if they have...
Cheddar? She paused and looked at me like I had 3 heads.
Cheddar?
Yeah, good old Ontario cheddar.
You're kidding, right? Why not just get some saltines and a can of easy cheese?
It's a taste of home for me.
Okay, we'll include a Canadian cheese. But let's make it Oka. That's from Quebec. And Quebec is right beside Ontario, isn't it?
She'd said that to be funny, and it would have been obvious even if I couldn't smell the mirth coming off her. I often made fun of how little she knew about Canada, and she enjoyed playing into that. As much neighbors as Canada is to the U.S.
My favorite Canadian cheeses, of course, are your cheesy jokes and puns.
She leaned in and kissed me. Thanks, but listen, I can't remember any of the cheeses you just mentioned, except maybe for the easy cheese.
Okay, I'll handle the cheese and the veggies. You head over to breads and desserts. I know you love your carbs. Man, I have no idea how you can pack away so many carb-heavy things and still maintain that buff bod.
I have my secrets, I said. And I immediately felt terrible for even joking about that. I could eat so much not only because my wolf metabolism was hyperactive, but the transformation into wolf form consumed a significant number of calories. It was one more lie to add to the list. They just kept stockpiling. I hadn't worked up the nerve to tell her the truth about my monthly 10-day cycles back in July, and that nerve never came. Because less than a week later, I had to make myself scarce for another 10 days. I used the excuse that I had to continue working on my novel deadline. That lie was easier to work with because I really did need that time. I truly had been behind schedule on the manuscript, and I knew this last extension had already pushed both my agent and publisher beyond what should have been the final straw. I realized the only reason I'd likely gotten away with it was the positive media related to the hype about the upcoming film release based on my first Bronte novel, Print of the Predator. But I was desperately under the gun. Because my nights were spent running around on all fours and howling at the moon, I'd needed to dedicate most of my daytime hours working on finishing the book to get it in for the latest July 20th deadline. And yes, admittedly, I didn't really want the writing of the novel to end, because I had tied working on the book with needing to see Gail for my research on it, despite the fact that we hadn't talked about the book in weeks. The manuscript for Tome of Terror had become in many ways a talisman of what allowed Gail and I to remain together. Yes, it had been the initial perfect excuse to keep seeing her, but I'd found it was something I'd clung to, as if afraid that once I handed the manuscript in, what Gail and I had would suddenly end. But I did turn it in on time. Mac would have likely strung my balls from the door of his office if I'd not come through. Being caught between that threat from Mac and the threat from Isabeau really put me in a bad spot. I'd managed so far to escape both, despite the ongoing monthly cycle of lies I kept doling out. Sure, I earned a living making shit up, basically lying for somewhere between 80 to 100,000 words. But lying to Gail, however, was significantly difficult, particularly when I could tell, with every single story I'd come up with, her trust and faith in me were wavering, teetering on the edge of collapse. My lie for August had been a need to be out of town to do some pre-movie release interviews in Los Angeles. It had been partially true. There were a number of interviews with Hollywood types that had all been done via New York to LA studio links and virtually, but Gail didn't know that. She'd actually asked if she could accompany me on that trip I'd made up. I concocted a flimsy excuse that I'd asked Mac if the studio or his office could pay for her to join me, but they didn't have the funding. And I'd known, with the repair bills related to the bee incident in her store, she couldn't afford to pay her own way for the trip. Fortunately, she never called me out on the fact that I could afford to pay for her to accompany me. But she wasn't the type of person to ever play that card, and she likely would have turned down me spending the money to have her join me. But the tension between us had continued to fester. September's lie was another out-of-town trip. This time it was to teach at a writing workshop in Lincoln City, Oregon, run by two book industry science fiction and fantasy veterans, the husband and wife team of Christine Catherine Rush and Dean Wesley Smith. The truth was, they had invited me to join them as one of the professional writers at a similar workshop, but that was for the following year. And so yeah, I felt bad.
Hey, Andrews, you okay?
I realized I'd been zoning out again. Yeah, I was just trying to remember the name of those Italian sweet cookies you'd mentioned that go with, what did you call it? That Bruno cheese?
Brunost.
She laughed and then shook her head. Yeah, that. What were those cookies called? It sounded like pizza.
Pizzelle.
Got it. Thanks. I've got my marching orders. I did an exaggerated dramatic turn and was about to mimic marching down the aisle toward the bread and dessert area when I bumped into a woman so hard I almost knocked her over. I'd been so distracted and admittedly confused over the names of the cheeses and other items Gail had rattled off that I hadn't even recognized the familiar scent of who that woman was. Oh, I'm sorry. I turned my head to see who I had bumped into. Her scent and familiar face struck me at the same time. It was the cold sky blue of her steel eyes fixed on me like a splash of cold water on my face. Rachel? I said, shocked to see her. Rachel Jean. Given how similar she looked to Jennifer Aniston, who played Rachel Green on the TV sitcom Friends, and the fact she still wore the Rachel hairstyle, the one her more famous doppelganger had sported on the first season of that popular program, I'd never forgotten her name. She never did admit to having changed her name to match the fictional television character's name, but I'd always suspected that. Rachel Jean and Rachel Green were just too much of a coincidence for someone who was the spitting image of Aniston. Rachel was an actress who took plenty of gigs leveraging her similar look to the celebrity, We had only dated for a few weeks back in 2004. I'd fallen for her rather quickly, as I'm wont to do. The fact she looked like a television star didn't hurt. And she was a truly lovely person. Perhaps she'd been a bit too much of a go-getter, always dreaming of making it big on Broadway and moving on from the string of commercials she'd been cast for. And she both leveraged and hated the fact her best work came, not from her own talent, but from the way she looked. When we'd been dating, we had regularly been interrupted by people thinking she was Jennifer Aniston. She had learned to stop denying it. Nobody ever believed her. They always thought she was just rude, so she went with it. She would sign an autograph, in her own signature, not try to fake Jennifer's, and pose for a photograph, completely making the starstruck fans' day, but then allowing her to get on with what she'd been doing. The conflict was something she truly hated. And I could understand it because I'd been fresh into accepting my fate of lycanthropy and what it meant for my life, and hating it. She might have been born looking like Aniston, while I'd been bitten to turn into what I became, but we shared that mutual conflict, which made her more attractive to me. Rachel had been the first relationship I attempted since turning into a werewolf. And despite my attraction to her, I never made a move on her. We'd been seeing one another for 3 weeks, and despite being infatuated and in awe of her, I didn't even attempt to hold her hand. She'd been the one to initiate our first kiss. And what a kiss it had been. It had progressed rather quickly to some heavy petting. We were in her apartment and had just enjoyed a late lunch/early dinner she had prepared. It was just hours before sunset on the day before I knew I would morph into a wolf. Because I had occasionally turned early, I was worried about either that happening or the intensity of my passion at the moment making me lose control. As much as I desired this beautiful woman, I'd been afraid of being there after dark and turning into a wolf. So I'd put a stop to it, rather awkwardly, I might add, by telling her I was embarrassed because of my hemorrhoids. And could we wait until they cleared up, which would just take a few days, and just stick to kissing? Rachel had, of course, been confused, hurt, and a little disgusted that I would even talk about such a thing. But what choice did I really have? After that idiotic move had killed the mood, I hastily made an excuse to leave her apartment and said I'd call her in about a week, once the swelling had cleared and it would be safe for us to partake in sexual activities. I did call, and I texted, repeatedly, but she never responded or called me back. And I'd never seen her again. Until today. You're looking really good, Rachel, I said. How have you been? I mentally kicked myself for stammering like Bob Newhart. Her cool blue eyes looked right through me. Excellent. I've got an amazing gig in Hollywood now. Things have never been better. That's fantastic, I said. So glad to hear you stuck with it. Gail cleared her throat beside me. Oh, I said, Rachel, this is Gail, my... Sticking her hand out and speaking before I could complete that sentence, Gail put on a huge grin and said,
Pleased to meet you, Rachel.
After shaking Gail's hand, Rachel eyed her up and down, giving her a very thorough look over. I could sense she was disgusted at just how gorgeous Gail was. You also seem to have done well for yourself, Rachel said, keeping her eyes on Gail. But you've also done well for yourself in your career, too, so I've seen. Sticking with writing really worked out in the long run. Congratulations on the movie deals. Thank you, I said. Rachel then turned her head back to Gail for another sharp glare, before turning back to me. Did your hemorrhoids ever clear up? Of course she had to bring that up. Even she knew it was a ridiculous excuse. Yeah, they did. It's water under the bridge now. But all you had to do was be straight with me. If you didn't want to be with me, you could have just told me you were gay or practicing to be a monk or whatever it was that meant you weren't into me. You didn't have to lie like that. I'm so... Yeah, I know. You're sorry. You said that a lot. But you still did it. For such a big guy, you've got absolutely no balls. I stood looking at her with my lips pressed together, unsure what to say. Gail was giving off a sense suggesting she was about to go into fighting mode, jumping to my defense. I raised my left arm in front of her to subtly tell her it was okay. And I also knew I deserved this too. Rachel fixed her eyes back on Gail. "Has he lied to you yet, sweetheart?"
No.
Gail said firmly, coming to my defense. But I could smell that she was lying. She had her doubts.
Never. And it's going really well.
Is it? Well, good for you. Or at least he still has you fooled. Don't worry, he'll fuck it up soon.
Rachel turned and stormed out of the deli, each distinct click of her heels on the sidewalk outside, an additional small stab to this facade, those lies I was telling myself. I would fuck it up soon, wouldn't I? You've been listening to Lover's Moon, a paranormal romantic comedy by Mark Leslie and Julie Strauss. Read by the authors. Lover's Moon is book 5 in the Canadian Werewolf Series, published by Stark Publishing and available in print, ebook, and audiobook. The music used in this production, Waltz Primordial by Kevin MacLeod featuring Alexander Nakarada, was licensed via Incomptech.com and is copyrighted by Kevin MacLeod.